Recently, I made a bad units tier list with my friend Mithril Zenith. It was a lot of fun to put together, as I really enjoy talking about the lower tiers of the Fire Emblem rosters, and I liked looking through the comments and seeing what people thought about those units. My evaluations of some of them have changed as a result, or at least my opinions or whatever. But there is one character in particular who got a lot of responses, most of them either surprised or confused or in a few cases upset that I bothered to even put her on the tier list, let alone ending up in the tier where we placed her, which was greatly outclassed some utility. That unit is, of course, Mercedes. As a result, I wanted to take a closer look at how Mercedes performs throughout the game, see if that changes my opinion on her, and see if I can clarify my thoughts as to why I believe that she is in contention for the worst student or possibly even worst unit in the game. Before diving in, I do want to go ahead and clarify that if you enjoy Mercedes as a character, or even if you enjoy using her as a unit, that is perfectly fine. If you don't like Mercedes as a character or as a unit, that's also perfectly fine. I know that for a lot of people, Fire Emblem unit analysis can get very heated, and I do want to urge y'all to remember that this is just video games, and that there are people on the other side of the screen. So if you disagree with me or with another commenter, please be kind to each other. I don't like seeing these sorts of discussions devolve into just angry yelling at or past each other. Before diving into Mercedes specifically, I do want to talk about the idea of a bad unit, because I feel like when you call a specific unit bad or suboptimal, a lot of people get ideas in their head of, well, I beat the game with such and such unit, therefore they can't possibly be bad. Fire Emblem as a whole is a series that is not designed to softlock you. With the exception of FE12 Bantu, I think that literally every unit in every game can be used on the highest difficulty in a team that will be able to succeed at the endgame. Some of them will definitely make it easier than others, and some of them definitely take less work than others, but using a bad unit is not going to make it so you can't see the end credits. Instead, when I talk about a bad unit, it is someone who is less ideal than the rest of the cast. Sometimes it's because they don't hit specific stat benchmarks, sometimes it's because they have access to a set of tools that just aren't especially helpful, and sometimes it's just that they're behind on the level curve and need a lot more experience poured into them. Whatever the case is, don't let my or any other Fire Emblem YouTubers' opinions on a unit stop you from using them. One last thing, when evaluating units, I think it is best to assume the highest possible difficulty, so this will take into account Maddening Mode, not New Game Plus. The reason for this is that on lower difficulties, units tend to blend together more, and this is especially true of Fire Emblem Three Houses. Alright, with all of that housekeeping out of the way, let's take a look at how the orphan daughter of Baron Martinez holds herself on the battlefield. While units in Three Houses can theoretically go into almost every class, depending on their gender, most of them have an indication as to one or two specific paths that are intended by the game. Mercedes is no different than this. She has boons in both Reason and Faith, and Banes in a ton of physical attributes. This pretty strongly points the way towards Mercedes going into a magical class build. Theoretically, she could also go into a bow-based build because she does have a budding talent in bows, but other than that, the game basically tells you this is a spellcaster, they do not need weapons, they need spells. So I think it behooves us to take a look at her spell list before anything else. On the Reason side of things, she gets Fire, Thunder, Bolganone, and Ragnarok. This is a very cookie-cutter spell list and is in fact only one off from what Dedue gets, meaning that she doesn't stand out with any especially useful tech on the Reason side. This isn't a terrible fate, however, as oftentimes mages in Three Houses are better used for their utility than their offensive magic, due to a combination of enemies actually having decent resistance stats, and spells just having pretty weak might in comparison to physical weapons. But before doing a deep dive into Mercedes' faith skills, I do want to take a brief moment to touch upon her personal skill, Live to Serve, as it is closely tied to her healing spell utility. Live to Serve causes Mercedes to recover HP equivalent to the amount that she heals on other units. This on the surface appears to be a massive upside and a great benefit to her being your dedicated heal bot. After all, she can keep herself healthy while keeping her allies healthy. What's not to love about that? Functionally, however, this is not really that impactful. It's not bad, you don't hate it, and it's sometimes nice to have, in particular in the very early game, but Mercedes is not a frontline unit, and is typically too frail to survive more than one round of combat anyway, and sometimes she even gets one-rounded from full HP. As such, the amount that she heals from Live to Serve tends to be very unimpactful. If Mercedes does happen to eat a hit in chapters 2 or 3 and is able to recover herself up through healing over the next couple of turns so that she can eat another hit, that is definitely nice, but it comes up much less often than you would expect and is basically a non-existent personal skill. That said, most of the personal skills in Fire Emblem Three Houses are functionally non-existent, and Mercedes at the very least doesn't hurt her, so it's better than Goodie Basket. All in all, I don't think Mercedes having a functionally useless personal skill is a huge point against her, but I don't think it is the massive selling point that people present it as. It is probably slightly more useful than things like Catnap or Animal Friend, but functionally it is a self-recovery spell on a unit who should never be below max HP anyway. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's finally take a look at this healing mage's healing spells. At D and D+, Mercedes gets the standard Heal and Nosferatu spells. Upon reaching Faith level C, she gets access to Physic, which while not universal, is extremely common amongst the cast. And then her two more unique spell slots are Restore at B Faith and Fortify at A Faith. Since Mercedes' easiest and likely most common role is as a healer, I want to take a moment to focus on these healing spells. Physic is really nice because it allows her to heal up the units who need it without putting her in a position where she is vulnerable to attack from foes that can potentially one-round her. Restore is more useful than you would think it is, because if a unit gets hit by a gambit and therefore rattled, you generally want to be able to restore them so that they can move again. Theoretically, you could use it to cure poison as well, but I think the biggest utility is curing the rattled status. And then we move on to her A-rank faith spell, Fortify, and this is very disappointing. It seems to be positioned as Mercedes' biggest selling point, as only she and Flayn gain access to it, but Fortify is just not really a good spell in Three Houses. There are two main reasons for this. The first is the prevalence of low health builds. In Three Houses, some of the most powerful tools you gain access to are dependent on your HP being lower. Stuff like Persecution Complex from Bernadetta, the Vengeance Combat Art, or the combination of Vantage and Wrath as a method to sweep entire armies. Since Fortify hits an entire area, it's often a little bit awkward to fortify to heal the units you want to heal, but not heal the units you want to remain at low HP. It's not impossible to do, but it makes positioning more complicated, and sometimes it can rely on you turning off a unit you don't want to turn off, or not being able to heal a specific unit who you really want to heal if you're using Fortify. However, even if you are running an army that has no low health builds whatsoever, I still think Fortify is a rather weak spell, especially for A-rank Faith. It only has 2 uses, or 4 if you're in the Bishop or Gremory class, and covers about half the length of Physic. While it does hit everyone in the area, I find that oftentimes Fortify is equivalent to 2 or maybe 3 Physics in a single cast. And the reason for this is Three Houses is not a game where you're going to get a lot of units that need healing each turn. Even if you aren't using any low health builds, the enemy phase units are going to be either dodge tanks or protection tanks. Both of these are types of units that, if built properly, shouldn't need healing on every turn, or even most turns. Dodge tanks should be able to get their avoid high enough that they dodge almost every enemy, and on most enemy phases, dodge every enemy that comes up against them. Meanwhile, protection tanks should be able to stack their protection high enough that healing is needed very minimally, maybe every 2 or 3 turns. Like, let's be honest, even if you're not warp skipping, in the mid and late game of Three Houses, how many of your units are seeing combat on enemy phase, taking enough hits that they want to heal, but not enough hits that they die? I feel like in most cases it's 1 per turn, in which case Physic is just better, especially when you factor in how late in the game A-rank Faith comes. If you had access to Fortify in Chapter 2 or Chapter 3, it would be a godsend. A lot of units see combat, and most of them can only survive one round. But by the time you actually get access to Fortify, healing is significantly less important, even to teams that are not using any low health builds. Okay, but on the topic of Chapters 2 and 3, let's take a look at how Mercedes actually performs in the early game. The first 5 or so chapters of Three Houses are easily the hardest portion of the game. This is in part due to the fact that the game has no traditional Jagen, and in part due to the fact that you haven't had time to start building resources and investing in your students to allow them to keep up with the insane stat and skill combinations that Maddening Mode presents to you. As such, I think it's valuable to take a zoomed-in look at each of the early game chapters and how Mercedes performs on those particular maps, instead of just a broader look at her in the early game as a whole. Also, because units don't exist in a vacuum, I do think it's fair to compare her performance to her colleagues in the Blue Lions, as well as the healers Linhardt and Marianne, who she is somewhat directly competing with as the role of dedicated house healer. Okay, so her Chapter 1 performance is, to be frank, quite awful. Since she starts at D Faith and E+ Reason, she has no offensive spells available to her for the entire map. This means if she wants to engage in any combat whatsoever, she has to do it with a physical weapon utilizing her 6 strength, which is not ideal. For context, in testing her performance on Chapter 1, she dealt 3 damage to Dorothea and 0 damage to both Ignatz and Laurens. She was also one-rounded by every enemy she faced, requiring her to use one of the 3 bows available to even attack people. And she's not dealing any damage while attacking people, so the only utility you get out of Mercedes in Chapter 1 is the heal spell, which only has 5 uses because she's stuck in Commoner. All in all, a very poor performance, especially when you factor in some of the other Blue Lions you could field instead. Dedue is probably the only unit able to protection tank reliably on Chapter 1, and even has the ability to survive Edelgard if he's at full HP. Meanwhile, Felix gets a massive boost from his personal skill for free since there are no battalions available in Chapter 1, and has high enough speed to not be doubled by the majority of enemies as long as he equips an item like the Iron Sword instead of a heavier item like the Iron Bow. Annette and Sylvain make good arguments for coming along as well, thanks to Rally Strength and Tempest Lance respectively. And while Byleth and Dimitri are forced and therefore aren't competing with Mercedes for a spot, they do definitely perform better than her because of Tempest Lance and Wrath Strike, and also just having incredibly good stats. Ingrid and Ashe are units who you probably don't want to bring to Chapter 1, but if you do, they'll probably perform better than Mercedes because of Tempest Lance and Curve Shot being incredibly good combat arts. In fairness to Mercedes, however, this poor Chapter 1 performance is something that she shares with both her healing counterparts, Linhardt and Marianne. It's just hard to justify dedicating an entire deployment slot to a unit whose only real contribution is going to be casting heal 5 times, and then perhaps baiting an enemy out since the map is on forced casual mode. I will say that access to Nosferatu gives Linhardt and Marianne a slight edge over Mercedes, but let's be honest, if they're casting Nosferatu, it's usually going to be for self-improvement. Really, the D Faith only hurts Mercedes' ability to develop her Faith rank and get access to stronger spells for Chapter 2. But on that note, let's talk about Chapter 2. It is one of the hardest maps in the game, and a cruel introduction to the difficulty of Maddening Mode. There's archers with access to 3 range, thieves with pass who one-round half of your team, and just in general a lot of nonsense going on. You also only have 3 battalions and lack access to mission assistance, and haven't had time to build up the large amount of gold needed for weapons and vulneraries to keep your entire team stocked up. It can be incredibly helpful if you manage to get your in-house healer to Physic for Chapter 2. However, Mercedes is at a significant disadvantage as she starts at D Faith instead of D+. While this is only 1 rank's worth of difference, it ends up being a very big deal for Chapter 2. I've heard it proposed that it is literally impossible to get Mercedes to Physic, and so I decided in my most recent Maddening run to attempt to see just how true that was, by giving her a significant amount of favoritism, much more than I feel she deserves. I didn't employ her in Chapter 1 because I felt that that level of favoritism wouldn't actually help her. She would only be casting heal 5 times, and it would get her a little bit of faith experience, but wouldn't really get her on the way towards what she wants to do, and she couldn't really gain any experience through combat due to not getting Nosferatu even if she casts all 5 heals on that map. However, I did devote the very first meal I could to her in order to fill her motivation gauge for tutoring. I then spent all 4 of her tutoring spots on Faith. I did not rig a perfect, but made sure that she didn't get any bads. For her goals, I set it to be strictly Faith, meaning she would get 1.5 times Faith experience, but would not gain any experience in a secondary skill. I think that in general, for a long-term unit, you want to avoid setting their goals to only be one skill, as they gain less skill experience overall in doing this, but if you are looking for a short-term goal, such as getting Physic by Chapter 2, it is generally acceptable to do this. Even with the single Faith goal, the meal and tutoring session, Mercedes was still unable to reach D+ by the beginning of the Forced Auxiliary battle. However, she did get D+ during the battle. This meant that she was able to gain some experience through casting Nosferatu on the battle, however, not as much as she would otherwise, as she had to earn it on the field initially. Theoretically, if I had brought her to Chapter 1, she could have gotten maybe 1 or 2 more pot shots in with Nosferatu, but it was difficult to get as many shots as I could with her as she is incredibly frail, and there's not too much terrain for her to take cover in that doesn't leave her vulnerable to the soldiers attacking her from terrain as well. I don't think it's feasible to make Mercedes the MVP of the auxiliary battle, so I did the next best thing and made Byleth get MVP, therefore getting 50 motivation on Mercedes. I devoted this 50 motivation to another round of Faith tutoring and made sure to rig it so she didn't get any bad results. I also rigged Mercedes to be able to participate in choir practice as she gains some Faith experience off of that. It's extremely minimal, but I wanted to demonstrate just how much favoritism I was giving her. I then gave Mercedes quite possibly the largest piece of favoritism possible, and attended Manuela's lecture for the Forced Seminar instead of Seteth's. For those who are not aware, Seteth's lecture gives lances and authority, which most units want one or both of. Examples of units who want both are Dedue, Sylvain, Dimitri, Byleth, some of the best units in the game. However, I took this valuable resource away from them in order to give Faith to Mercedes, and even with all of this favoritism, she remained 4 points of Faith experience away from being able to cast Physic at the start of the map. Now, this did mean that she was able to earn Physic on the map in order to contribute her Physic uses, but it's kind of ridiculous that even with all of that favoritism, she doesn't get Physic until partway through the map. I also want to highlight just how much this hurts the Blue Lions. While almost every unit benefits from an authority lecture, Dimitri's most feasible build relies on him getting to A authority as quickly as possible, so that he can use the coveted Battalion Wrath Battalion Vantage combo to sweep entire enemy teams. Dedue does not start with Tempest Lance, but greatly benefits from it and wants to learn Lances anyway because of Vengeance access. Sylvain and Annette both appreciate it because of access to Swift Strikes and Good Rallies, respectively. And Byleth appreciates Lance training due to wanting to go into Pegasus Knight and having trouble getting all of the ranks as quickly as possible due to the fact that she cannot be tutored. I think it is generally correct to use Seteth no matter what house you are in, but Blue Lions especially benefits from both of his attributes. As a result, I think it is generally fair to assume that Mercedes is not going to have Physic by Chapter 2, which makes her role as a healer significantly worse. She can cast Heal 5 times, which is pretty helpful, but since she's unable to cast Physic from a distance, it can make positioning tricky, both because she is rather frail and will die to archers and fighters and survive at 1 HP against the thieves, and also because oftentimes you're going to be battling on the staircase near the start, and things get really cramped really quickly. It's hard to position your bow users, your rally bots, and Mercedes in such a way that you have room for all the people that you want. That said, if you're playing defensively, you're likely going to be taking on enemies in groups of 3 with a couple of turns in between each, and Mercedes can very easily use these turns to heal up her comrades, meaning that positioning is less important if you choose only to heal during these turns. On the other hand, due to the way that the heal formula works, Mercedes is only healing 1 more HP than a Vulnerary, and while money is fairly tight in the early game, it's not impossible to buy 5 or 6 Vulneraries, so oftentimes Mercedes will just be saving you a little bit of money, and you could just use the player phase action to heal that unit if you are waiting in between waves of enemies. Still, this is probably the chapter where healing is most important and most useful, and I think Mercedes deserves a little bit of credit for that. She's still probably performing worst in this chapter out of all of the Blue Lions, but it's not by a super large measure, and since you can deploy everyone, you might as well deploy and use her. Still, if we look at how she stacks up against the other dedicated house healers, she is noticeably worse. Both Linhardt and Marianne have the capability of reaching Physic by Chapter 2 without going to the Manuela lecture. While they definitely require some amount of favoritism to get there, it's not the same amount that Mercedes requires, and in Linhardt's case, it is building you towards Warp, the most powerful faith spell in the game, so it's favoritism that you probably want to give him at some point anyway. Unfortunately for Mercedes, a bad performance in the early game tends to snowball, and this is doubly true for magically inclined students. Without access to Physic in Chapter 2, it is extremely unlikely for Mercedes to reach level 5 by Chapter 3. She simply does not have the casts available to gain enough experience to level up, especially when you consider maddening experience gains. To demonstrate this, I played Chapter 2 with all of the previously mentioned favoritism other than the Manuela lecture, and she was unable to reach level 3. She barely got to level 2, and that was with exhausting all of her Nosferatus, including taking a couple of kills. Theoretically, you could do some auxiliary battles in between Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, but this is absolutely not worth it, as Exploration allows you to boost your Professor rank and is incredibly important to do early on. This leaves Mercedes in an extremely awkward position for Chapter 3. She still needs favoritism to reach Physic, but it is much less in competition, and it's pretty likely that she's going to be able to reach it for Chapter 3. Unfortunately, Physic in Noble or Commoner only has half casts, so she will have 5 heals and 3 Physics available to her. This is definitely better than her performance in Chapter 2, but she has stronger competition. There are 2 reasons for this. The first is that Chapter 3 introduces the mission assistance mechanics. Basically, you take a student from out of class and are able to use them as a controllable unit who doesn't gain experience but gains support with Byleth. Due to the way that mission assistance works, any magically inclined student will become a level 5 monk with at least D in both faith and reason for Chapter 3. In addition to that, both Linhardt and Marianne will have Physic if they are chosen as mission assistants for Chapter 3. As such, if you want a premier healer with 10 uses of heal and 5 uses of Physic, all you need to do is sacrifice your mission assistant slot to either Marianne or Linhardt. And if these are units that you want to recruit anyway, it's not a sacrifice because you will gain support points with them for every action they do on the map. Even if you're unwilling to sacrifice your mission assistant slot for a Physic bot, Lysithea is another compelling choice for Chapter 3 mission assistants, and she also competes with Mercedes as she will be a level 5 monk, meaning she has full access to the 10 uses of heal. She does not have Physic available, so it's sort of up in the air as to which one of them is a better healer, but I lean towards Lysithea because she has an overall 10 uses as opposed to Mercy, who only has 8 uses, although 3 of those uses are in Physic. Lysithea is also a unit who you frequently want to mission assistance anyway, simply because it builds her support faster, and early access to Lysithea allows you to more quickly train her faith and get Warp online. However, the other piece of competition that Mercedes has is, to my mind, the sort of final nail in the coffin in terms of her extremely poor early game performance. You see, Chapter 3 is when Ana becomes available for recruitment, and there is a case to be made that Ana is a better healer in-house than Mercedes on Chapter 3. Anna joins at level 5 as a Myrmidon. She has a Faith rank of E+, and 3 weeks of studying before the Chapter 3 mission. If you set her goals to Faith and nothing else for 1 week, and then Faith and any other skill for the other 2, she will reach D before the Chapter 3 mission. This allows her to certify into Monk and have 10 uses of heal for basically free. She does not require any tutoring or any experience in chapters 1 or 2 in order to accomplish this. The only resource that you need to sink into Anna is a beginner seal so that she can change from Myrmidon into Monk in order to utilize the 10 casts. Additionally, Anna's high speed means that she is doubled by fewer enemies on the map, and since she doesn't have any offensive spells, you can successfully unequip her if you are worried about her being weighed down by weapons. I would argue that this makes Anna a better healer in Chapter 3 than Mercedes, although I don't think it is definitive, but the fact that there's even a conversation going on about that is pretty pathetic. You have to invest into Mercedes for her to become a unit who is arguably worse than Anna. One of the worst units in the cast of Three Houses. Last but not least, if we check in on Linhardt and Marianne's in-house performance, they are both able to do the same thing they could as an adjutant, and Marianne has the advantage of very likely unlocking Frozen Lance at this point. I don't want to get into the whole Frozen Lance discussion, but it is one of the strongest combat arts in the game, and probably the strongest one you'll have access to in Chapter 3, due to the fact that it results from a budding talent rather than a specific rank. Upon reaching Chapter 4, the bad times aren't even necessarily over for Mercedes yet, as it's not unreasonable for her still not to have reached Chapter 5, even if she used all of her casts on both maps. You have to feed her quite a few kills, but let's be generous. In the spirit of this video, we're being generous to Mercedes, and assume that she's hit Chapter 5. At that point, she is a fairly competent in-house healer. She has access to 5 uses of Physic, 10 uses of Heal, and let's say we maybe even gave her some reason tutoring so that she can cast Fireball and stuff. I do think it's nearly impossible to get her to restore for Chapter 4, which is a shame because that would really help considering the frequency of gambits has gone up each chapter. But she's still a competent healer. She's probably on the same level healing-wise as Linhardt and Marianne are, although Linhardt has more long-term potential going for him, and Marianne is able to do fun stuff with Frozen Lance. In competition to the other Blue Lions, she is actually holding her weight, I would say. Healing is pretty important in Chapter 4, and she's going to be doing it. She can even potentially do it without you having to sacrifice a mission assistant slot. This is probably Mercedes' best chapter, but it's not a standout performance. And it's something that could pretty easily be replicated by mission assistants Linhardt or Marianne. This would free up some amount of the favoritism that Mercedes receives to go into other units, but if we're being perfectly honest, I'm not sure how much of that you could transfer into other units. At this point, your Professor rank will probably be high enough that the Chapter 3 and 4 tutoring sessions are kind of more plentiful than you need. Your roster is still going to be pretty small at this point because it's hard to recruit all of the recruits that you want by now. So yeah, I would say that Mercy is perfectly serviceable in this chapter, and training her to be is taking away from the rest of your students pretty minimally. It might make recruitment hard to get if depending on how many out-of-house students you plan on using in your team, and it might cause you to have to wait on tutoring Byleth skills, but at the end of the day, it's not the worst thing in the world, and it's not something like Physic in Chapter 2 or 3 where it is pretty unreasonable to get her there. At risk of ruining the rare Mercy W, though, the fact that her being perfectly serviceable is a standout chapter is pretty damning. While the cost is not huge to get her to be competent at this point, there is still a cost. She's going to be taking some skills away from people in order to reach level 5, and she's going to be taking tutoring sessions or meal sessions away from other students, or possibly even Byleth's faculty training. It's a manageable cost, but it is a cost nonetheless. And all of that for a competent healer who is easily replicable at much less cost. On the out-of-house side of things, it is even more pathetic. Mercedes still does not have access to Physic as a mission assistant, which is just like why do you grab her then? Like, the only reason I can think of to grab Mission Assistance Mercedes is if you desperately want to recruit her for the early game, but I don't think an out-of-house Mercy does anything for your team in the early game. She's just a worse version of the healer you already have access to. Even if you desire her to be on your team long term, I think that it's better to delay her recruitment and therefore her mission assistance in order to prioritize the people who are going to be very impactful early on or who want tutoring ASAP. And that brings us to Chapter 5, and it's much the same story as Chapter 4. It's a pretty difficult chapter, and Mercedes' healing is appreciated, but it is nothing that stands out from her healing competition, and it's still not going to be the most valuable unit in your army, especially when you consider that this is the point where your gold starts being less of an issue, and so you can pretty easily deck out units in vulneries or concoctions if need be. Her ability to heal means that they have their player phase for free, which is always nice, but she's going to be doing a little bit more than a vulnerary and less than a concoction, so it's not like super great awesome sauce or anything. The biggest upside is Restore, which is not guaranteed, but is also not as difficult to get as it is in Chapter 4, and there's more dangerous gambits in Chapter 5, so it's actually really appreciated. It's hard to say whether Chapter 4 or 5 is a better performance for Mercedes. She's more likely to have Restore in Chapter 5, which is really good, but you're also more likely to have Catherine, Cyril, and possibly even Lysithea, so she has much stronger competition, and she really hasn't grown as much as they would. As far as out-of-house stuff is concerned, Mercy finally has access to Physic. She's just 2 chapters later than the other healers, and doesn't really offer anything beyond that. Like, Live to Serve is not really doing much for you because you really shouldn't be seeing combat. If all you want out of your mission assistance is a Physic bot, then Linhardt offers you more long-term for recruiting him for Warp, and Marianne offers you more long-term for recruiting her because of Frozen Lance. Now, I could go more into how she performs in Chapter 6, Chapter 7, etc., but I feel like I've pretty thoroughly made the point that Mercedes' early game is just really pathetic and is outclassed by multiple units, including some low-tier units. That said, there are examples of units in Fire Emblem who have pretty rough starts and end up performing competently or even excelling. Vanessa comes to mind from Sacred Stones, Shanna from the Binding Blade, Mozu from Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, and plenty of other examples. So does Mercedes fall into that camp of a training project that is well worth the hardship? Well, let's take a look at the 2 routes that the game seems to be pointing us towards. The first is Dedicated Healer. I touched on this when covering her spell list, but I do not think that it's especially valuable. 3 Houses gives you so much access to healing, and oftentimes much less need of it than other games have. Each unit has 8 inventory slots, in which they can hold multiple vulneries or concoctions or even elixirs, and you get a lot of money, so purchasing consumables to heal is not a big deal. Some units want to do other things with their player phase, such as wait for alert stance, but others are fine just chucking a vulnerary. Additionally, many units who you want to deploy for reasons other than healing just have access to healing spells as part of their kit by default. A Frozen Lance user like Marianne, or a Warper like Lysithea or Linhardt, or even your Dancer will sometimes have turns where they don't have anything better to do and can just fire off a heal in case of emergency. There's also some pretty low tier options like Healing Focus for units who don't need more than 2 combat arts, or a Healing Adjutant. I don't think any of these are particularly worthwhile, but they are things that compete with Mercedes, technically speaking. And they're competing over a very limited amount of healing that you want to be doing. A lot of the best builds in 3 Houses can be split into 2 different categories. Either incredibly frail units who do player phase stuff, such as spamming a combat art, or incredibly durable builds that oftentimes will face enemy phase down without taking a single point of damage, such as dodge tanks, protection stacks, or Vantage Wrath units. While it is important to acknowledge that a good deal of these are low health builds, such as traditional Vantage Wrath or Vengeance users, not all of them are. Somebody who relies on doing Frozen Lance or Hunter's Volley and is simply too frail to take an enemy doesn't need healing, even though they aren't hurt by it. On the flip side, protection tanks want to stack their protection so high that they're taking 0 times 4 from enemies, and dodge tanks have their avoid so high that they are not taking any damage because they dodge every enemy attack. Sometimes they will be unable to reach the coveted 100% avoid and will potentially take one attack, in which case getting physicked up is incredibly desirable and helpful, but this is a task that any magical unit can do and isn't reserved for Mercy. As I mentioned before, units like Flayn with Rescue or Lysithea with Warp can use a turn to heal someone who needs it, and if nobody needs healing, they have something to do. Mercy, on the other hand, if you go the healer route, really doesn't have anything to do with her player phase if nobody gets injured or an HP level up and needs healing. Shoutouts to Ferdinand von Dodge Tank. So this leaves us looking for something else to do with her. Due to her significant number of physical skill banes, I think that the only thing that stands out as an option is focusing on her bows. Mercedes has a budding talent in bows, which I haven't mentioned until now because it's not especially useful in the early game, and only becomes relevant if you want to use her long term and want to funnel her into a route other than the dedicated healer. Upon 12 tutoring sessions, Mercedes will gain Waning Shot, which is pretty worthless, and a boon in bows, which is actually desirable. A bow proficiency can allow any physically capable unit to get into Archer for hit plus 20, and any unit whatsoever to get into Sniper for bases that will carry them for the rest of the game, and access to Hunter's Volley. Once you have tutored her the requisite 12 times, you can set Mercedes' goals to bows and authority, or if you really want to get it done fast, just bows, leave her be, never tutor her for the rest of the game, and she will eventually reach Sniper and be fine. Like, Sniper's a very good class, and it's hard to be a bad unit when you have access to Sniper bases and Hunter Volley. Sniper's bases and Hunter's Volley and Silver Bow Plus is enough to one-shot almost any enemy on the final map. The problem is, this is not something that Mercedes is contributing, it's something that Sniper bases are doing. Yeah, her bow budding talent helps her get there more easily, but she's far from the only unit with a bow proficiency, and she is probably the one who's going to struggle the most to reach level 20 if you are focusing on bows and sticking her into physical classes. She's also less likely to be able to get some of the supplementary skills that Hunter's Volley users appreciate. In particular, Death Blow requires mastery of the Brigand class. She has a Bane in Axes, meaning that it takes her more effort to get to Brigand than other units would, and she's not especially physically competent, so if you want her to master Brigand, you probably need to make her an adjutant instead of having her master it on her own. This isn't a death sentence by any means, and is something that is definitely attainable, but all of this effort and favoritism gets her to be just a replica of any other physical bow unit. Like, her personal strength growth is 25%, so she's not going to have phenomenal stats, and will rely on Hunter's Volley for kill power. The biggest potential benefit she has is the ability to use magic bows Hunter's Volley, but that ends up being very expensive. And yeah, gold is pretty plentiful in Three Houses, but if you are firing away Hunter's Volley with magic bows time after time, you have to get arcane crystals and then pay for forging to repair them. It adds up, and it becomes less good than you think, and it will take away resources that other builds who deserve them more need. While Mercedes does get access to a might support, this is not really the selling point that people make it out to be. The biggest upside to might supports is when it's a unit who can easily be an adjutant for you. For example, Seteth getting a might support from Flayn is nice because she can freely turn into a Pegasus Knight and isn't a unit that you'll miss deploying. Annette is definitely a unit that you want to deploy if you have access to her, and so making her the adjutant for Mercy just to give her a might support is less than ideal. While you don't need to make her an adjutant in order to take full advantage of the support, she does have to be adjacent to Mercedes if you want to get the might bonus and not make her an adjutant, which can require some weird positioning because Annette often wants to be in other places for goddess dancing or rallying purposes. At the end of the day, if you choose to use Mercedes long-term as a sniper, she will still be able to kill enemies if you forge her expensive weapons, but she's doing so off of the strength of sniper bases, and requires some significant favoritism to get to this point. I think that if you are a fan of her as a character and want to use her long term, this is the best way to do so, but it doesn't speak highly to her when her best performance is something that other characters can get into more easily and generally perform better and faster in. So, with all of that in-depth analysis out of the way, what is the final verdict? Was I wrong about Mercedes? Well, I mean, kind of, yes. I previously stated that I felt she was in contention for the worst unit, competing with units like Ashe and Ana, and described her as a dedicated healer in a game that does not need or want a dedicated healer. However, I don't think either of those things are true anymore. I don't think Mercedes is competing for the worst unit in Three Houses. I think she pretty definitively is the worst unit in Three Houses. The fact that she's a worse healer than even Ana at a time when healing is most valuable is just sort of a strong counterpoint to the idea that she is a dedicated healer. Long term, you can make her into a healer, but she's not going to be a better healer than your other healers just because she takes more favoritism to get there and ends up producing similar results. And while she has the option to turn into a sniper in order to be a contributing team player in the mid to late game, it's something that's not unique to her, and many other low tier units such as Ashe are able to access this and other endgame builds more easily than her. Additionally, I think that Ana's free access to Monk healing and Ashe's free access to Curve Shot in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are significant strengths that put them above Mercedes, as they are actually doing something in the early game, and they are equally capable of going into a generic build like Sniper with Hunter's Volley as she is. To my mind, the biggest selling point that Mercedes has is Restore, and I think it is a little bit undervalued as Curing Rattles is very nice. But considering the amount of effort it takes to get there in a reasonable time, it's simply not enough to drag her out of the last place. This isn't a damning fate, because, again, Three Houses has by far the strongest cast of any Fire Emblem game, and I think Mercedes is still a very competent member of the team if you give her the favoritism that she wants. It's just simply not favoritism that she deserves when you stack her up against both her in-house and out-of-house comparison, and in both the long-term and the short-term, every other member of the cast will perform better than she will. It kind of sucks to end on a downer, so I do want to go ahead and give the Mercedes fans some hope for a more positive Mercedes video in the future. Starting next week, I am beginning a series of story-focused videos called SRPG Sapphics, where I will be taking an in-depth look at the queer women of Fire Emblem. The first woman I'm looking at is Heather, and that video has already been recorded, edited, and scheduled to go up. However, I will be looking at Mercedes fairly early in the series, as I want to look at some of the positive aspects of her, that being her characterization in the story and her as a queer representation. I think Mercedes is a very fun character, and I think you should feel free to use her even in maddening runs, even in challenge runs, if you like her. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in seeing more of my content, feel free to hit the like, subscribe, etc. button so that stuff shows up in your feed. And if you want to talk about Fire Emblem, leave me a comment or go ahead and join the Discord, links in the description. Have a wonderful day, and be kind to each other, be kind to yourselves, and bye!